1217, the Fifth Crusade begins, a clash of civilizations. As the dawn of the 13th century unfolded, the tension between the Christian West and the Muslim East had reached a boiling point. The memory of the Holy Land's capture by Saladin still haunted the hearts of many in Europe. Pope Innocent III, fervent and determined, called for a new crusade, one that would finally reclaim the sacred territories and assert Christian dominance over the East. Exciting news. Before we get into today's video, I've got an amazing opportunity for you. Have you ever wanted to learn Hebrew? Now's your chance. We're offering a unique beginner Hebrew class, and the best part? You set your own budget. That's right, you decide how much you want to invest in your Hebrew learning journey, and we'll review your registration to make it work for you. To get you started, we're offering 3 free introductory classes. No commitments, just a fantastic opportunity to see how enjoyable and rewarding learning Hebrew can be.
Very good, Barak. If you find the beginning of a verb, of a shoresh, one of our 3...
So why wait? Dive into Hebrew today and explore a rich new language and culture. Click the link in the description to sign up now and start your Hebrew journey. All right, let's get back to the video. In the year of our Lord 1217, banners bearing the cross were unfurled across Europe. Knights, lords, and commoners alike, fueled by religious zeal and visions of eternal glory, heeded the call to arms. The Fifth Crusade had begun, a campaign marked by its ambition to strike at the very heart of the Muslim world, Egypt. This was no ordinary conflict. It was a clash of civilizations, where faith and honor were wielded as weapons. The Crusaders, united under a divine mission, embarked on their journey, their hearts burning with the desire to reclaim Jerusalem, and their minds set on toppling the powerful Ayyubid Sultanate. As they gathered in Venice and the ports of France, a vast armada of ships was prepared. The air was thick with the anticipation of battle, the weight of history pressing down on the shoulders of every man who sailed towards the distant shores of the East. The Crusaders knew they were part of something far greater than themselves, an epic struggle between Christendom and Islam, where the fate of nations hung in the balance. But unbeknownst to them, among the ranks of those who sought war and conquest, one man journeyed with a different purpose. A humble friar from Assisi, whose heart yearned not for bloodshed, but for peace. St. Francis would soon step into the heart of this storm, driven by a divine mission of his own, a mission that would bring him face to face with the Sultan of Egypt in an extraordinary encounter that would defy the very nature of the conflict raging around them. The stage was set, the players in place, and the world watched as the Fifth Crusade began, an event that would echo through the ages, not only as a tale of war, but as a testament to the power of faith, conviction, and the possibility of peace in the darkest of times. The year was 1219, and the world was aflame with conflict. The Crusaders, driven by the fervor of their faith and the promise of heavenly reward, clashed with the armies of Islam in a brutal struggle for dominance over the Holy Land. But amidst the clash of swords and the cries of battle, a solitary figure set out on a journey that defied the very essence of war. As the war drums echoed across Europe, Francis of Assisi, a humble friar clothed in tattered robes, felt a calling that could not be ignored. His heart, filled with the love of Christ, burned with a desire not to conquer lands, but to conquer hearts with the message of peace. With nothing but his faith to guide him, Francis embarked on a perilous journey to the East, determined to walk into the very heart of the crusade. The journey was fraught with danger. Francis traveled through treacherous lands where the shadow of death loomed large over every step. Yet with unwavering resolve, he pressed on, his eyes fixed on a singular vision, to bring the light of the gospel to those who knew it not, and to sow seeds of peace in the midst of a world torn apart by hatred and bloodshed. When Francis finally arrived in Egypt, the air was thick with the stench of war. The Crusaders had laid siege to the city of Damietta, a strategic stronghold on the Nile. The battlefield was a grim spectacle, thousands of men on both sides ready to die for their cause, their swords thirsty for the blood of the enemy. It was into this crucible of conflict that Francis walked, a lone pilgrim with a message that seemed as fragile as the olive branch he carried. Yet Francis was no ordinary man. His courage was not born of steel, but of faith. He believed that even in the heart of war, peace could be found. He sought not to convert by force, but by the power of love and the example of Christ's humility. And so, with the battle raging around him, Francis set his sights on a meeting that would defy all logic, a meeting with the mighty Sultan al-Kamil, the ruler of Egypt and nephew of the great Saladin. As he approached the Sultan's camp, Francis knew he was walking into the lion's den, but his heart was untroubled, for he carried within him the conviction that he was on a divine mission. With nothing but his simple faith and the courage that comes from true conviction, Francis crossed the battle lines, ready to face the Sultan and to speak the words of peace that his soul so desperately wished to share. The world watched in wonder as this humble friar from Assisi stepped into the very epicenter of the crusade, armed with nothing but his faith. In a land where armies clashed and kings vied for power, Francis came not as a conqueror, but as a peacemaker, offering a different kind of victory, one not won by the sword, but by the Spirit. 1220. The return of a peacemaker, a vision beyond the battlefield. The journey back to Italy was a quiet one, yet it was not the same Francis who had set out from Assisi months before. The fires of war still raged in the east, but within Francis burned a different fire, a fire kindled by the insights he had gained in the most unlikely of places. When he had set foot on the blood-soaked sands of Egypt, Francis of Assisi was driven by a simple yet profound mission: to bring the light of Christ to those who walked in darkness, and to offer the hand of peace to those locked in the chains of conflict. He had faced Sultan al-Kamil, a man whose power was matched only by his wisdom, in a meeting that defied all expectation. Francis had not swayed the Sultan to embrace Christianity, but in that tent, under the shadow of the Crusade's brutality, something remarkable had occurred. A dialogue. Two men from two worlds torn apart by war had spoken not as enemies, but as human beings. The Sultan had listened, not with the ears of a ruler, but with the heart of a seeker. And in that brief exchange, Francis glimpsed a truth that transcended the battlefield. Peace was not merely the absence of war, but the presence of understanding. As Francis sailed back across the Mediterranean, the memories of his encounter with the Sultan filled his thoughts. He saw in that meeting the seed of something far greater, a vision where Christians and Muslims could see each other not as foes, but as brothers in the shared pursuit of the divine. It was a vision of a world where dialogue could bridge the chasms of misunderstanding, where love could conquer hatred, and where faith could heal the wounds of centuries. The shores of Italy came into view, and with them, the familiar sights of home. Yet Francis's heart was heavy with the knowledge of the task that lay ahead. The world he was returning to was still steeped in conflict. The church he loved was still entangled in the machinery of war. But Francis knew that his journey had only just begun. He returned to Assisi not as a crusader, but as a messenger of peace, carrying with him the insights gleaned from his time in the East. He spoke to his brothers of the power of love over violence, of the strength found in humility, and of the vital importance of peaceful dialogue between Christians and Muslims. His words were not always easy to hear, for they challenged the very foundations of a world built on conflict, but they were the words the world needed. Francis's return marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life and in the life of the Franciscan order. The friars, who had once set out to preach the gospel, now understood that their mission was also to be ambassadors of peace. The lessons Francis brought back from his encounter with the Sultan would shape the Franciscan way for generations to come, a way that sought not only to spread faith, but to build bridges of understanding between the children of God, no matter their creed. And so, Francis of Assisi returned to Italy, a man forever changed, with a vision that would echo through the ages, a vision of peace in a world torn by war. Epitaphs 1223, The Rule of Peace, a vision written in the heart. The small cell in the hills of Assisi was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight as Francis of Assisi sat alone, his heart heavy with the weight of the task before him. It had been years since his journey to the east, years since he had stood before Sultan al-Kamil and glimpsed the possibility of peace in a world torn by war. Now, that vision had crystallized in his soul, and it was time to set it down in words, words that would guide his brothers not only in their faith, but in their mission to bring peace and love to all. The Franciscan order had grown beyond anything Francis could have imagined when he first embraced a life of poverty and humility. What had begun as a small band of brothers had blossomed into a movement, one that spread across Europe, touching the lives of countless souls. But with growth came challenges, and Francis knew that his brothers needed a clear path, a rule that would not just govern their actions, but their very hearts. As he dipped his quill into ink, Francis paused, his mind drifting back to that fateful encounter in Egypt. He recalled the Sultan's gaze, not of hostility, but of curiosity, perhaps even respect. It was in that moment, in the tent of his would-be enemy, that Francis had understood a profound truth. Love knows no boundaries, and peace is the gift of God to all, regardless of creed. With these thoughts, Francis began to write. His hand moved steadily, each word flowing from the depths of his soul. The rule he drafted was not one of rigid commands, but of living principles, principles that would guide his brothers in every aspect of their lives. It spoke of poverty, yes, and humility, the very cornerstones of the Franciscan way. But above all, it spoke of love, love for one another, love for the poor, and love even for those who did not share their faith.
Let all the brothers, wherever they may be,
He wrote,
preach by their deeds. Let them live in peace with all, embracing the whole world with their love.
These were not mere words, but a call to live as Christ lived, to see the image of God in every person, to sow seeds of peace, even in the most barren of hearts. Francis knew that his rule would be tested in a world still gripped by conflict and division. But he also knew that the only true path for his brothers was one of peace, a peace that extended beyond the boundaries of Christendom, reaching out to embrace even those who were deemed enemies. This was the radical love that Christ himself had taught, a love that Francis had seen reflected in the eyes of the Sultan, a love that he now sought to enshrine in the very foundation of his order. As he finished the final lines, Francis felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. The rule was complete, a testament to a life lived in the service of God, and a blueprint for a future where the Franciscan brothers would be not only messengers of the gospel, but ambassadors of peace and love in a world so desperately in need of both. The candle flickered as Francis set down his quill, the ink drying on the parchment that would soon be sent to Rome for approval. He knew that his journey was far from over, but with the rule now written, he had given his brothers the greatest gift he could, a path to walk that led not to conquest or power, but to the simple, profound truth that peace and love were the highest callings of all. And so, in that humble cell, Francis of Assisi sealed his legacy, not with the might of an army, but with the power of words, words that would guide his order for centuries to come, words that echoed the very heart of Christ's teachings.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God.
"1226, the passing of a saint, a legacy of peace and humility. 1226, the twilight of St. Francis of Assisi's life was marked not by grandeur, but by the same humility and simplicity that had defined his journey from the very beginning. As the year drew to a close, Francis, worn and frail from years of service, knew his time on earth was coming to an end. The once vibrant friar, who had walked barefoot through towns and forests, preaching the love of Christ, now lay weak and emaciated, his body broken by a life of self-denial and sacrifice. Yet his spirit remained unshaken, his heart still aflame with the love of God. In the small, humble hut near the Porziuncola chapel where it had all begun, Francis prepared to meet his Creator. The brothers who had gathered around him were filled with sorrow, knowing that their beloved founder was slipping away. But Francis, ever the bearer of joy, comforted them with a gentle smile, his eyes reflecting a peace that transcended the frailty of his mortal body. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields of Assisi, Francis asked to be laid on the bare ground, a final act of humility that mirrored the life he had chosen. The brothers gently lowered him, and Francis, with his face turned towards the heavens, began to sing. His voice, though faint, carried the words of the Canticle of the Sun, a hymn of praise to the Creator, a song of gratitude for all the blessings of creation, even in his final hour.
Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister death.
He whispered, acknowledging the end of his earthly journey with the same reverence he had shown to life itself. To Francis, death was not an end, but a passage to eternal communion with God, a return to the source of all love. In those final moments, Francis's thoughts drifted to the many souls he had encountered along his path, the lepers he had embraced, the poor he had served, the Muslims he had met with words of peace rather than the sword. He had seen the image of God in each of them, and it was this vision of universal brotherhood that he left as his legacy. His life had been a testament to the power of humility, poverty, and above all, love. A love that knew no boundaries, a love that sought to heal the wounds of a divided world. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Francis felt the presence of his Lord drawing near. The brothers, sensing the end was near, gathered closer, their prayers mingling with the soft rustle of the evening breeze. Francis, with one final breath, whispered the words that had guided him through every trial, every joy.
Lord, I give you back my life, which is all yours.
And then, in the stillness of that holy night, Francis of Assisi passed from this world into the arms of the God he had loved so dearly. The brothers wept, but their tears were not of despair, for they knew that Francis's spirit would never truly leave them. His life had been a beacon of light in a world often shrouded in darkness, and that light would continue to shine through the order he had founded, through the teachings he had shared, and through the example he had set. News of his passing spread quickly, and from all corners of Christendom, people mourned the loss of the man who had lived as Christ had lived, poor, humble, and full of compassion. But even in their mourning, they celebrated the legacy he left behind, a legacy of peace, of love, and of an unyielding commitment to seeing the divine in every person, regardless of their faith or station in life. And so, St. Francis of Assisi departed this world as he had lived in it, without fanfare, without riches, but with a heart full of love and a soul at peace. His life had been a pilgrimage, not only towards God, but towards the hearts of all people, and in that journey he had discovered the true essence of holiness: to love, to serve, and to see all as brothers and sisters in the family of God. His legacy would endure for centuries, inspiring countless souls to follow the path of humility, poverty, and peace, and reminding the world that true greatness lies not in power or wealth, but in the simplicity of a heart surrendered to love. Later centuries, a beacon of peace, the saint and the Sultan. As the world moved forward from the turbulent days of the Crusades, stories of war and conquest began to fade into the annals of history. But amidst the tales of battles fought and kingdoms won, one story endured, a story not of victory through might, but of triumph through understanding. It was the story of a humble friar from Assisi and a wise Sultan of Egypt, whose unlikely encounter would become a beacon of hope in a world often divided by faith. Just 2 years after St. Francis of Assisi had breathed his last in the small rustic hut near the Porziuncola, the memory of his life had already taken root in the hearts of people across Christendom. His radical embrace of poverty, his love for all of creation, and his commitment to peace had left an indelible mark on the world. On a summer day in July, the city of Assisi buzzed with anticipation. Pilgrims, clergy, and the faithful gathered from far and wide, converging upon the grand basilica that was being constructed in his honor. Today, the man who had once lived in rags, preaching to the birds and serving the lepers, was to be canonized as a saint. Pope Gregory IX, who had once been moved by Francis's humility and devotion, presided over the ceremony. As the solemn rites were performed, the air thick with incense and the voices of the choir rising in unison, the Pope proclaimed Francis a saint, a model of Christian virtue to be venerated for all time. The crowd erupted in joyful celebration, for they knew that Francis was not just any saint. He was a man who had shown the world that true holiness was found in love, simplicity, and peace. Yet, even as St. Francis was formally recognized by the Church, another narrative began to take shape, a narrative that transcended the boundaries of Christian Europe. The story of Francis's journey to the East, his fearless crossing into enemy territory, and his peaceful dialogue with Sultan al-Kamil began to echo beyond the confines of Christendom. It became more than just a tale of a saint. It became a symbol of what could be achieved when faith was paired with openness, when courage was expressed through compassion. In the centuries that followed, the encounter between Francis and the Sultan was retold in countless ways. To Christians, it was a reminder that the gospel of Christ called not for domination, but for love and understanding. To Muslims, the story of the Sultan's wisdom in engaging with a Christian friar with respect rather than hostility became a symbol of the values of hospitality and dialogue central to their own faith. Together, these two men, once separated by the lines of war, became icons of the possibility of peace between their peoples. As Europe and the Islamic world continued to interact, sometimes in conflict, but often in exchange, the story of Francis and al-Kamil served as a touchstone. Theologians and scholars invoked it as proof that dialogue between different faiths was not only possible, but necessary. In a world where religious differences so often led to violence, this story stood as a powerful counter-narrative, a tale of faith meeting faith, not with the clash of swords, but with the meeting of minds and hearts. By the time the story had reached the later centuries, it had woven itself into the fabric of interfaith dialogue. In an age of growing awareness of the need for peaceful coexistence, the meeting of the saint and the sultan was celebrated as a model of what humanity could achieve when guided by the principles of love, respect, and humility. Churches, mosques, and synagogues alike found inspiration in their example, using it to foster conversations that sought to bridge the divides that had long separated communities. St. Francis of Assisi, canonized in the grand halls of the church, became more than just the patron saint of animals, nature, and the poor. He became a universal symbol of peace, a man whose legacy transcended the boundaries of his own faith, reaching out to touch the lives of countless people across different religions and cultures. His encounter with Sultan al-Kamil became a testament to the power of dialogue, showing that even in the darkest of times, peace could be found when people chose to see the humanity in one another. As the centuries rolled on, the story of St. Francis and Sultan al-Kamil continued to inspire. In schools, universities, and places of worship, their meeting was celebrated as a shining example of what true dialogue could achieve, a legacy that endures to this day, reminding the world that peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of understanding and respect between all people.